Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Prosciutto Plum Focaccia. That's right, instead of just poking the dough with our fingers, we're going to be pushing in some prosciutto-wrapped plum, which not only produces something incredibly delicious, but makes for one of the most beautiful focaccias you will ever see. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this very simple dough, which begins with some dry active yeast, to which we will add some very warm water, as in like 105 degrees or so. And what we'll do is simply let this sit for about 15 minutes to allow the yeast to wake up, or bloom as we call it in the business. And if you don't have anything better to do, and you look really close, you can actually watch this happen. Oh yeah, that is some active yeast, which is exactly what we want. And once that yeast has bloomed for about 15 minutes, we'll add the rest of the ingredients, which will include some olive oil, a little touch of sugar, followed by some all-purpose flour. Oh, and a little bit stuck in the bowl, so I went back and added the rest, which I'm only mentioning so you don't think that's a different ingredient. But anyway, we'll finish up with a little bit of salt, at which point we'll grab a wooden spoon and give this a mix, and we will keep mixing until things come together to form a very sticky, very soft dough. And then what we usually do with things like this, once our dough does come together, we normally transfer it onto the work surface, and then use some flour to knead the dough and shape it back into a ball. But this time we're not going to do that. All right, what we'll do here once it's mixed is drizzle over some olive oil and then rub a little bit on our hands, at which point we'll stretch and form this back into a ball of dough that's going to be fairly smooth and uniform, but it really doesn't matter since we're going to let this slowly ferment in the fridge, which means we really don't have to do any kneading at all. So while this type of dough does take a little bit of time, it takes very, very little effort or attention. And as we're balling this dough up, we want to make sure we incorporate any dough that's still stuck to the bowl. And that's it, our work for today is done. And we will simply wrap the dough and pop it in the fridge overnight, where it may or may not double in size, which is basically where we want it to be before we move to the next step. So what I generally do is pull it out in the morning, and then simply let it sit on the counter warming up until I think it's doubled in size, which at this point I thought mine had. And you know the rule of thumb for dough rising. If you poke it and it deflates, it's ready, which means we can take it and move to the next step. But before we do, let's go ahead and rub a little bit of olive oil onto the counter, since I find that a lot easier to shape with than trying to use flour. And that's it. Once our surface and hands are oiled, we will press and shape our dough into a rectangle, pretty much as large as we can get it. And if your dough seems really elastic and it keeps pulling back and won't stay stretched out, you can simply stop and let it rest for a few minutes and then continue stretching and pressing. But anyway, once we eventually get that pressed out into a nice big rectangle like this, we'll go ahead and fold that into thirds one way. And then once that's been accomplished, we will fold it into thirds the other way, which is going to produce a nice thick rectangle of dough, which we will then press back out, but not quite as large. Right, this time we're only shooting for something about 6 by 9 inches. And once we do, we will stop, and we'll transfer that onto a very generously olive oiled sheet pan. And then what we'll do before we move into final production is drizzle on some olive oil and rub that all over the surface before we cover this, and then let it proof at room temp for a couple hours, or until it spreads out and kind of puffs up a little bit, which might happen sooner than 2 hours, depending on how warm your kitchen is, or how cold your dough is when you started this. But anyway, we'll keep an eye on it. And while we're waiting, we can prep our plums. And by prep, I mean carefully slice some pieces like this. And even though that pit in the center is going to stop the knife and sort of protect your hand, we still want to be very careful. And for me, a thin serrated knife is perfect here. But as long as you can get 12 nice wedges about this size without cutting your hand, use whatever you want. And that's it. Once our fruit is cut, we will take some nice thinly sliced prosciutto, and we'll tear off small pieces, and we'll wrap these up. And by the way, this will totally work with peaches instead, or apricots, or poulots, or pretty much any stone fruit. So feel free to use those other options if you want. I mean, you are, after all, the panettiere of what kind of fruit this focaccia should carry. But for me, plums have the perfect balance between sweetness and acidity to pair most perfectly with that salty prosciutto. But no matter what you use, once those are done, we'll wrap it up and pop those in the fridge until we need them. And we'll head back and check our dough, which for me had been proofing about 2 hours. And as you can see, it's definitely spread out a bit. and also risen some, and the surface should feature a few bubbles here and there. So to me that was looking just about perfect. So I proceeded to the optional step of sprinkling this with some freshly chopped rosemary, which I really enjoy. But if you're not into it, leave it off. And that's it. If this was regular focaccia, we would start poking this with our fingers. But here we're going to take our prosciutto wrapped plum, and we're going to push those in, and we're going to push them in deep. All right, I don't want you literally going all the way to the pan, but almost all the way down is recommended. And since I wrapped 12 pieces of fruit, I used a nice uniform 3x4 pattern, which I thought would give us the perfect ratio between meat, fruit, and bread. Although we will be discussing that decision at the end of the video. And then once our prosciutto wrapped plums have been inserted, we will give the surface another light drizzling of olive oil before our final step, which is to sprinkle the top with some nice coarse flaky sea salt. And we want enough to taste and feel it, but we don't want too much. So please put on the perfect amount. And that's it. Once that's been sprinkled over, this is now ready to transfer into the center of a 475-degree oven for about 20 minutes, or until it's beautifully browned and looks like this. Oh yeah, when this came out of the oven, two thoughts came to mind. The first was, that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And then I thought, you know what, we probably could have snuck some more plums in there. And we'll discuss that in a minute. But while this is still hot, what we want to do is brush it with some olive oil, just for a little bit of added richness, and also to kind of shine it up a little bit. And once we do that, we can go ahead and transfer this onto a rack, where we will, in theory, let this cool down to room temp before we cut it. But fair warning, that's going to be very hard to do. And if you were to transfer this to a cutting board and slice off a piece while it's still slightly warm, I don't think anyone would blame you, or me. But anyway, I did go ahead and cut a piece. And I was beyond pleased with the texture. Right, this featured a thin, crispy crust surrounding a very light, very airy, very tender inside. And after admiring that, I went in for a nice big bite. And that, my friends, truly was magnificent. Right, above and beyond a pretty much perfect focaccia bread, we have that sweet and sour fruit wrapped with that salty, savory ham. And when you get some of everything in one bite, it is absolutely magical. Which brings up the issue I mentioned earlier. We probably could have pressed this out a little larger and a little thinner, and then maybe have done like 16 or 20 pieces of plum, just so there would be more in each bite. But the real question is, even though we could have done that, should we have done that? Right, there's a certain psychology involved when we just put a small amount of a very flavorful filling or stuffing in something that's blander like a bread, which makes each bite that features that extra special and has us craving more, which was sort of what was happening here. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought, which I'll call my wife Michelle's school of thought, is put as much of the good stuff as you can fit on or in. So I promised her next time I would try it that way. But really, either way works beautifully, and there's really no wrong way to do this. And whether you make this exactly as shown, or you push in even more prosciutto wrapped plum, either way, I truly loved how this came out, and I really do hope you give it a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.